In the fiscal case, such institutions are less obvious. It's a very important problem, and it's something that some of the brightest economists are thinking about, and I look forward to seeing what they come up with. There are large wealth and income disparities across nations. You already saw that illustrated in my three initial charts, the contrast between the nations in Africa and the other ones I had plotted. Some nations have incomes of less than 1/50th or 1/60th of what the incomes are in the more well-to-do nations. These low incomes are often the result of government policies, country-specific policies that either directly, sometimes directly, but often just indirectly restrict the set of technologies that can be implemented in that country. Often there are vested interests who have the ears of the politicians, and they convince the politicians to impose restrictive policies that would prevent new technologies from being implemented. There's a lot of knowledge available. In this age of globalization, that's one of the benefits, that knowledge travels easily. It can easily travel from the United States or from Europe to Western Asia, Eastern Asia, to Africa, and to Latin America. It can travel all over the world. Now, it doesn't mean that all this knowledge, all this technology can be usefully implemented everywhere. The various nations are different. Some may have better conditions for doing some things than others, but there is that knowledge available, and with some nation-specific innovative activity, there is no reason why, and in the absence of conflicts, of course, these conflicts also scare investors, as could, for example, happen in Pakistan, as we learned recently. They could make these countries suffer in the longer run. I would like to end by paraphrasing the final sentence, I believe, of a very useful book written by Parenta and Prescott called Barriers to Riches. It's a very compact book. I think it's on the order of 120 pages long, but it's full of not just theoretical knowledge, but also lots of examples going back, for example, on the history of China, going back thousands of years. Very interesting book. And what they conclude with is, with good policy, there is potential in poor nations for not 1% to 2% increase, but 1,000 to 2,000% income increase. Clearly, they're trying to be a little cute by adding those 3 zeros to each of those digits, but there is something to what they're saying. South Korea showed that it can be done. Their income per capita grew 6-fold over a 25-year period. We think of some of these African nations where the income is on the order of $500 per capita, 1,000% increase. That's increasing tenfold. That just brings you up to 5,000. While for the more well-to-do nations, as you saw, we're talking about $10,000, $20,000, $30,000. That should be the minimum over a reasonable 10, 20, or 30-year period. It can be done. It would make life much better in those nations. It would provide conditions for more long-lasting peace. But unfortunately, there are these conflicts. I think peace and economic development are closely connected. In some cases, the causality runs in one direction. In some cases, the causality runs in the other direction. But it's very important to think about economic development, and especially in those less well-to-do nations, to think about what can be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kydland. We, of course, now will have an open forum, and to start off the open forum, we have given the privilege of asking the first questions to 3 of our students in the economics department who are well on their way to becoming 3 out of 5 expected summa cum laude graduates in March when we have our commencement. So we will, without putting undue pressure on these students, we have given them that opportunity to be asking the first 3 questions. After that, we will be, of course, opening it to everybody else. The usual request applies that when you do ask your question, please introduce yourselves and identify your affiliation for the benefit of Professor Kydland and, of course, the rest of the audience. So may I first call on Ms. Krista Victoria, one of our upcoming summa cum laude. Please approach the nearest microphone when you do ask your question.
Good afternoon, Professor. Okay, my question is, given the many shocks that are happening in the world today, in particular, what you mentioned earlier, the U.S. subprime mortgage crisis, the looming U.S. recession, oil price hikes, things like that, what policy measures would you recommend?
I don't think there's that much the government can do to avoid the shock if it is to happen. Sometimes if the government tries to interfere in the short run, then things can happen. The resulting outcomes can be bad for the long run. And to me, the long run has always been much more important than the very short run. And so I would be very careful about making specific recommendations. What's going on is the danger is that as a result of this crisis, the banks will become more cautious, maybe more cautious than is in the interest of society as a whole in their financial intermediation. If there's anything central banks could do, if there's anything for them to think about, it would be to try to find ways to minimize the effect, the negative effect on financial intermediation. But what we're likely to see now is a reduction in the nation's productivity for a period of time. Exactly how long that period is likely to last is hard to say, and that probably is reflected in the fluctuations we've seen in the stock market. As I'm sure you all know, when you own a share in the stock market, that means you own a share in that particular company, in its capital. And the value of that share depends on how productive that capital will be in the future, something that's not easy to assess, especially today. The uncertainty introduced because of the subprime mortgage crisis is much greater than we've seen in the past 10 or 15 years. And so the assessments, people are trying to read the signals, the assessments change, and sometimes one sees positive things that might suggest that it's going to be over and not too long. And then another you see some additional bad data coming from somewhere in the world. So I think what it's going to take is to get over this crisis, and then in the long run, I believe, at least for the developed countries, for countries like the United States and European Union countries, Scandinavian countries, and so on, I don't think their ability to produce efficiently will be diminished substantially from this crisis, except initially for it could be 1, 2, hopefully not more than a couple of years, and then they'll be back to working the way we've seen them being able to work when the crisis blows over.
Thank you. Call next on ASEAN. Let me call first on Paul Cheng, who will be the second of our 3 upcoming economists, summa cum laude. Paul?
Professor, good afternoon. If you don't mind, I'd like to push your talk a little bit into the field of political economy. My question is this: how do you see inter-country political relations in terms of your model? Because I think you're talking about consistency in terms of policy, but I also think that inter-country relations in terms of power play a very important role in this model that you talk about. Can you comment a little bit on how do you see it in that field?
Well, that's a rather broad question, but so I'd like to narrow questions down to more specific examples. And let me just ask you if this is an example. In Europe, for example, if you looked across nations 20 or 30 years ago, or more, 40 years ago, and you talk about that conduct of monetary policy, you had the contrast between the Bundesbank. The Bundesbank was always regarded as one of the most independent and independent-minded central banks in the world. At the same time, in Europe, there were countries like Greece and Italy and Spain where monetary policy, where they were much closer to falling prey to what I call the time inconsistency disease. These countries have now gotten together to conduct monetary policy jointly. If that cooperation can contribute to the commitment of these policies to a low inflation environment, it will clearly be to the best for all of these countries. And it can be debated whether it really benefits Germany much because their monetary policy was already so benign. But I'm sure that for these countries, these 3 countries around in the Mediterranean, monetary policy is now conducted, or at least has been conducted in the past 20 years, in a much more benign way. So that's an example where countries can maybe get together and jointly try to create a commitment mechanism if it's difficult to do individually.
I think that is a positive example, but I think very recently I forget the specific meeting, but there was a meeting on trying to amend the Kyoto Protocol, something like that. So that is on the more negative example where countries do not as easily